Welcome back to the Bible Made Easy with Stephen Craig. Before we get into today's lesson, I want to review our Old Testament timeline. We looked at our timeline and we said that the first 11 chapters of Genesis deal with the history of the world. But then in chapter 12, when God calls Abraham to be the father of the Jewish nation, the Bible changes its focus because everything else that happened in the Old Testament is really focused on that promise that God made to Abraham to bring Christ into the world through his descendants. We said that in the book of Genesis, we read about the development of Abraham's family. Then when we get to the book of Exodus, of course, we read about Moses and how God chose Moses to lead the children of Israel to Mount Sinai. And then we looked at, of course, how the children of Israel journeyed from Mount Sinai after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years to the Promised Land. And so those books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy tells us about the children of Israel leaving Egypt, their time at Sinai, their time in the wilderness, and how they reached the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. Then we have our first historical books when Joshua, book of Joshua, that tells us how the children of Israel went into conquered the Canaan land. Then we had the book of Judges, the second book of history, that tells us how the children of Israel were ruled in those first few hundred years before they had kings. And so the time of the Judges includes the book of Judges, the book of Ruth, and the first part of the book of 1 Samuel. Then in 1 and 2 Samuel, we read of the establishment of the kingdom, the United Kingdom, that stood for 120 years, that had three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And as we get into the historical book of 1 Kings, we see the reign of Solomon, and then that's where we're going to see that the kingdom divided. Now, in our last lesson, as we looked at the period of Judges in the United Kingdom, we looked at the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon, each reigning 40 years, that made up the 120 years of the United Kingdom. And we saw that during the time of Solomon, of course, he married many foreign women. I made a mistake the last video. I referred to his 300 wives and 700 concubines. It's the other way around. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. But nevertheless, it said that in his old age, that they turned Solomon's heart away, unfortunately. And upon his death, there's going to be a division between the kingdoms. His son Rehoboam is going to become king in his place. And when the other tribes approach him and ask him to lighten up, like they were under a heavy tax burden and thing from the days of Solomon. But instead of listening to the old wise counselors, Rehoboam listened to his young foolish men who told him to be even harder on the people. And because of that, 10 of the 12 tribes rebelled and formed the northern kingdom of Israel. So this is going to be an important time in Israel's history, this period of the divided kingdom. Each of these kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Judah, are each going to have 19 different kings. But this northern kingdom, established by Jeroboam, is going to be founded upon idolatry. When he becomes king, he's going to set up two golden calves, one at Dan and one at Bethel, and tell the children of Israel, "Behold your gods, O Israel." I think it's significant, that the children of Israel, after being in Egyptian bondage when they're at Mount Sinai, when Moses was receiving the law, of course, they built a golden calf. Well, interesting enough that during the reign of Solomon, that Jeroboam was afraid of Solomon, and he had fled to Egypt. And it was only on the death of Solomon that he returned. Well, I think it's interesting, after that time being in Egypt, when he established this northern kingdom, that he established it with those golden calves as their idols. Now, God had promised Jeroboam that if he'd be faithful to him, that he would establish his house just like he established the house of David. But instead of trusting God, he followed his own heart. He set up these golden calves and established a total false system of worship that was devised from his own heart instead of God. And so because of that, they're going to have, this northern kingdom is going to have a history of 200 years from approximately 933 BC to 721 BC, when they're going to be taken into Assyrian captivity and scattered throughout the Gentile world. And interestingly enough, that the Assyrians are also going to take foreigners then and bring them back and plant them in the land of Israel. And that is, of course, where later the Samaritan people are going to come from. Now, as I mentioned, both of these kingdoms, Israel and Judah, are going to have 19 different kings. But the main difference is all the kings that are going to reign in Judah are going to be descendants of David. While this northern kingdom, they're going to have 9 different dynasties. It has 9 different families. So there's a lot of murder and treachery in this northern kingdom. And because of their idolatry, I mentioned, they're going to go into captivity. Now, Judah is going to continue a little longer. They're going to continue about 100 years after Judea, but also because of their sin and disobedience to God, they too are going to go into captivity, not to Assyria, but to Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to come 3 times against the city, but we're going to go in that in detail a little more in our next lesson. You should probably be prepared with your phone to take a screenshot, because I'm going to give you a paper, a chart that's probably going to be very valuable to you as you go on through your study, because although this divided kingdom is a very important time, it's also a very confusing time, because this is going to cover the periods of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and also this is going to be the background for many of the prophets. So we're going to also look at the prophets in a future lesson. But I want to see how these kingdoms also looked on a map. You remember that during the time of Solomon is when Israel reached its peak of greatness. This was like the zenith for the nation of Israel, because through the efforts of David, who had subdued all the enemies, Solomon was able to reign over a kingdom that stretched from the borders of Egypt clear to the Euphrates River. So they had this united great kingdom under Solomon. But now, once the kingdom divides, this is what you're going to have. You're going to have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. You're going to have Bethel here in the south and Dan in the north, where the 2 idols are going to be set up. And of course, Judah is still going to have Jerusalem and the temple, which is going to be the true worship. That was part of the reason that Jeroboam set up this false religion, because he was afraid if the people of Israel went to Jerusalem to worship in accordance with God's will, that their hearts would be returned to Rehoboam and they would follow him. So Jeroboam set up that false system of worship with the golden calf, but it became sin for him and his people. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that when the children of Israel first came into the promised land, the power was pretty well divided. You know, because you had the children of Israel living in the Canaan land. You had the Edomites to the south of the Dead Sea. You had the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Syrians. You had the Phoenicians along the seacoast, the Philistines. But I said there's something that happened during this period of the divided kingdom, that you see 2 nations emerge, because while you have God's people living here in the Canaan land, you're going to have the Assyrian Empire here to the north and the Egyptians to the south. And they're going to be the 2 main powers during this time of the divided kingdom. And so that's why that we see when it came time for this northern kingdom to fall, it was Assyrian that took them into captivity and scattered them out among the nations. But then there's going to be another kingdom, Babylon, that's going to rise up. And Babylon is going to defeat both Assyria and Egypt. And Babylon is going to become the first of 4 great empires that rule the world up to the time of the coming of Christ. We'll begin looking at that in detail in future lessons. But now I want to give you a chart that's going to prove very valuable to you. And this is a chart detailing the kings. I'm going to put it a little close so you can maybe do a screenshot with your phone. Let's see, you can just take a shot at kings of Israel. I use this chart many times because it gets so confusing, because you're reading in the book of Kings and it'll say so-and-so king of Israel and so-and-so king of Judah. But when you look at this chart, it makes it a little easier, because you see what I told you, that in Israel you're going to have these 9 different dynasties. So you're going to have Jeroboam and then his son reign, and it's going to be taken over by another king and his son. Zimri was going to reign a short time. Perhaps the most ominous family of this was the family of Omri, because he had the son Ahab. And you remember Ahab is one of the most wicked people in the Bible. Remember Ahab, and he married Jezebel. Well, it just so happened that Jezebel was the father of Ithbaal, the king of the Zidonians. So you listen to their name, Jezebel and Ithbaal. Well, what do they worship? They worship the god Baal. So during the time of Ahab and Jezebel, not only did the children of Israel worship the golden calves that had been set up by Jeroboam, they also introduced Baal worship to Israel. And so this was definitely one of the low points in Israel's history during the family of Omri here, where there was 4 of their descendants reigning. And also it was bad because there was actually intermarriage between them and the southern kings. And one of the daughters of Jezebel actually usurped the throne for a time until she was eventually killed and the rightful heir was placed on the throne. But you see that God used this man Jehu to do away with the family of Omri and to rid the kingdom of Israel of Baal worship. And he had 4 sons that reigned, but he too didn't follow God with all of his heart. And then we see the kingdom fell into a period of instability, being reigned by different kings until they went into Assyrian captivity. As I mentioned, the main difference between northern and southern kingdom is that all these kings that are going to reign in Judah are going to be descendants of David. And some of these are going to be good kings, like Jehoshaphat. He was a good king, although we see here he's the one that intermarried with the house of Ahab, his family. But we had the good king Hezekiah and Josiah. But unfortunately, some of the kings of Judah were just as wicked as the kings of the north. And it's interesting that Hezekiah's father Ahaz and his son Manasseh were 2 of the worst kings. And to show how far they departed from God's word, that even during their reigns they got to the point where they practiced human sacrifice. They'd actually offer their children in sacrifice to idols. And so it was because of the sin that they too are eventually going to be led into Babylonian captivity. But this is a very important chart, because when you're reading in Kings or Chronicles, or even when you're some of the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and some of the other prophets also detail some of the history that's happening during this time, and they'll refer to the so-and-so king of Israel, so-and-so king of Judah. And if you have this chart, I don't know if you're like me, this visual aid really helps me to understand a lot better. So I hope this lesson has been informative, and Lord willing, in our next lesson, we're going to take a look at the captivity, some of the results and things that happen in captivity, and then that'll of course be followed by the study of the prophets. So I hope it's again been informative, and I hope you'll join me again.